All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's now say a word about the Euthyphro. Euthyphro, we want to look at a piece of this book as well, also from Plato. Now, many of Plato's dialogues are named for some particular person, and that's what's going on here with the Euthyphro. Euthyphro was a kind of religious leader in Athens, and the way Plato describes the story, Socrates runs into Euthyphro on his way into court. And it turns out that, we know what Socrates is doing. He's going to defend himself against charges of corrupting the youth and impiety. And we know how that turns out. Not so well for Socrates, or is it? I guess that's a matter for some debate. And it turns out that Euthyphro is there because he is acting as a prosecutor in a separate case. It turns out, in fact, that Euthyphro is there to prosecute his own father for some sort of crime. I forget what the details are. Socrates finds this rather incredible. It was not uncommon at all back then for families to stick together, and lots of people thought that you don't sort of turn on your own blood. And so this was rather unusual for Euthyphro to be prosecuting his own father, and the conversation turns naturally to what is appropriate to do, what is just. The word that actually gets used here is a Greek word meaning something more like piety. And what is the pious thing to do here? For us, pious has religious connotations, and it does for the Greeks as well, but it was nevertheless a more everyday sort of word. So the question then is, well, Euthyphro, I want to know, I being Socrates, I want to know about this thing piety. It seems like you're doing something rather unusual. Some people might think that it's impious or impious, and yet you seem to think that it's the right thing to do. So can we talk a bit about piety more generally? And in particular here, Socrates is interested not just in some examples of what the pious is, as he puts it, the pious. Right? We might rather say something like piety or piousness itself or something like that. Plato tends just to write the pious. And Socrates is interested not just in some examples of what is pious or what is not, but in the essence of pious. Right? What is it to be pious? And so we've arrived at sort of another huge sort of methodological hammer for philosophy. And in fact, it's really part of the self-understanding of Western philosophy since ancient times, which is that much of philosophy is engaged in what we'll call analysis or conceptual analysis. I'm going to share a screen here, just a blank page at the moment, but I just want to say a few words now about analysis generally. So in our case, Socrates is asking about, let's just say, the nature of piety or the pious. Okay. And what he's looking for really here is a definition as opposed to examples. Okay. Euthyphro doesn't cotton onto this very fast, and so he says, well, Socrates, you want to know what's pious? I think that what I'm doing right now, prosecuting the wrongdoer, I think that's pious. Right? And Socrates says, yeah, well, maybe it's an example of pious, right? Maybe it's an example of piety, an example of a pious action. But I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for the essence of piety. I'm looking for what it is to be pious. Okay? And the way we would understand this now, the way philosophers often put this is, right, what I'm looking for are a set of conditions, right? So definition of some concept C, right? What we want is a set of, here's our terminology for the day, necessary and sufficient conditions for falling under the concept of C. Okay. Necessary and sufficient. Now what that means in practice is, right? Well, let's take a simpler example. Okay. Sometimes analysis or definition is pretty straightforward. As we'll see, this turns out to be the exceptional case, but let's pick some easy case like, suppose I'm trying to define, I don't know, suppose I'm trying to define a square. So this is my concept to be analyzed. Okay. Maybe I'll put this in all caps just to make it clear that this is the concept I'm trying to define. Okay. And again, I might give some examples of squares, right? So I might say, oh, coasters are squares, imperfect squares, because, they're probably bumpy and they have a little thickness and so on, but coasters are sometimes squares, or, I don't know, record albums are sometimes squares. But the idea is not just to give examples, it's to define this thing. Okay? And I want conditions that are necessary and sufficient for a thing to fall under the concept square, that is, to be a square. Right? What does it take to be a square? Right? And so the idea is, well, first of all, right, what does it take? You have to be some sort of geometric figure, right? So we might say a square is a two-dimensional geometric figure having four sides. Okay. Now, we're not done yet, right? This definition doesn't, as it were, suffice, right? We have a couple of necessary conditions, right? So that means in order to be a square, you have to be a two-dimensional geometric figure, right? It's necessary to be a square that you be a two-dimensional geometric figure. It's also necessary that you have four sides. Okay. So far, right, these are necessary, all right. But what we really want is for our conditions to be both necessary individually and together sufficient for being a square. Right? You can think of this in terms of implications. So this idea of necessary condition, right? So to say that a condition is necessary, so condition, let's say, I don't know, D is necessary for the concept C, right? Basically that just means that if something falls under the concept of C, then it meets condition D. If something is a square, then it has four sides. If something is a square, then it's a two-dimensional geometric figure. Okay? But what we'd like to do is to also have conditions that are together sufficient for falling under the concept. So if I say the condition D is sufficient for the concept of C, then in effect what I'm saying is if you meet this condition, then you fall under the concept. Right? And in general, what we're going to be looking for here is, right, so typical case, right, conditions D1, D2, D3, however many we need, are each necessary for C, and together, right, so if we take all those conditions together, those things together imply that we've satisfied this concept. Right? Together sufficient for C. Okay, so let's think about this. All right, so far we have two-dimensional geometric figure having four sides. Those things do indeed seem to be necessary for being a square, as we've said, but they don't yet suffice, right? They are not yet sufficient for the concept of being a square, because after all, a rectangle, a rectangle that has, different values for length and width, that thing is a two-dimensional geometric figure having four sides, and yet it fails to be a square, right? Which means that we can meet these conditions, two-dimensional geometric figure having four sides, without meeting this concept, right? And so that means that just shows that these conditions, even the both of them together, are not yet sufficient for being a square. Okay, so let's start over again. We'll call this our first attempt here. Okay. So let's try this again. Right? First attempt specified necessary but not yet sufficient conditions. Okay. So what do we need to add in? Well, something is a square. Sure, it's two-dimensional and it has four sides, but we also have to add in a couple more things. So geometric figure having four sides, and we can say of equal length. We're not done quite yet because so far this applies to all rhombuses, whereas we want a square in particular. So the sides have equal length, and we'll say it has four right angles. Okay. So I think that now is a complete definition. That now looks like we have necessary and sufficient conditions for being a square. And to say again that they're sufficient is to say, right, that anything that has four, that's a two-dimensional geometric figure and has four sides of equal length and has four right angles, that thing, that's enough to specify sufficiently that we're talking about a square. Cool. Okay, so pretty easy in the mathematical case. I mean, after all, these concepts are sort of, designed by us in the first place, and we want them to be precise and so on. So it's not so hard to find necessary and sufficient conditions for being a square. Much harder for things like piety. Nevertheless, philosophy often understands itself as aiming for complete analyses of concepts like this. Right? How can we have a conceptual analysis of, time or being or life? Right? All these sort of large philosophical questions, you can think of them often as asking about conceptual analyses. Right? What is it to have free will? Can we analyze the concept of free will? Okay? That turns out to be surprisingly difficult. Right? There are lots of debates in the philosophical literature about what free will is. So there isn't even really agreement about that. Can we have an analysis of the concept of lying? Right? Not a particularly philosophical concept, but it's certainly obviously relevant to philosophical questions, especially ethical questions and so on. There is debate about even that. Right? So there is disagreement, for example, about whether the lie that you tell has to be something false or not. Is it not enough just that you believe that the thing is false? Well, people go back and forth on this. One example that I like to trot out is trying to give an analysis of the concept of, I guess I'm using all caps, bachelor. Right? The idea of being a bachelor. And you might think that this is pretty straightforward, but it's not altogether straightforward. So you might say something like, well, what you need is an unmarried single adult male. And I guess we better say human because, unmarried pigs are not going to count as bachelors. And that maybe looks like we're done, but we're probably not quite yet done. So at this point, a philosopher might say, well, what about a Catholic priest? Is a Catholic priest a bachelor? And I think most people would be inclined to say, well, no, the Catholic priest isn't really a bachelor because the Catholic priest isn't sort of eligible for marriage in the proper way, right? So maybe a bachelor also has to be eligible for marriage. Okay. And then someone might say, well, what about a divorcee, a divorced man? Is that guy a bachelor? And I don't know what I think about this. I'm not sure what my intuitions are here. But you might think, yeah, maybe the divorcee doesn't count. Maybe in order to be a bachelor, you have to have been never married before, right? Notice this would also eliminate widowers, and I don't know what I think about them either. But maybe I think they're not really bachelors. So maybe we want to say something like never married single adult male human who is eligible for marriage. That's looking pretty good now. We might sort of fight a bit about what adult means exactly. There's another concept we might try to analyze. But for now, let's just suppose that we're sufficiently clear on what that means. This now maybe looks like a complete set of conditions that suffice for being a bachelor. Okay, so let's go back to the Euthyphro now for a moment. Remember that what we're trying to do in the Euthyphro is we're trying to analyze the concept of piety. Okay. Euthyphro first says prosecuting the wrongdoer. And Socrates says that's just an example, right? Not a complete definition. Notice, right, if we want to have necessary and sufficient conditions, that means that we can go from the concept to the conditions and from the conditions to the concept. Well, it may be that we can go from prosecuting the wrongdoer to pious, but it seems that we can't go the other way, right? It doesn't seem that every case of piety is a case of prosecuting the wrongdoer. So then Euthyphro says, all right, well, what about this? What's pious is what is dear to the gods. Okay. Now that looks a bit better. That looks like the sort of thing that Socrates is looking for. But Socrates says, well, but the gods disagree with each other about which things they hold dear. Right? And if we're going to say that what the gods love, maybe that's better to say what the gods love. If we want to say that what the gods love is pious and what the gods hate is impious, well, certain things are going to be loved by some gods, hated by other gods. By this definition, they would be both pious and impious at the same time. That doesn't seem right. Euthyphro tries again. This, of course, is an illustration of just the kind of, annoying line of questioning that Socrates was getting prosecuted for in the first place. Here's Euthyphro. Socrates can't resist one last time sort of pestering him. So Euthyphro says, all right. Maybe what piety is what all the gods love. Okay. And Socrates says, okay, now that sounds pretty good. I don't have sort of an obvious objection to this. What he does, though, is he presents Euthyphro with a question. He says, now, are pious things pious because the gods love them? Or do gods love pious things because they're pious? they, that is, the things. The things are pious. Whoops, pious.